At first glance, it looks harmless. Music, applause, bright fabric cutting through the air as bodies leap, spin, and crash back toward the ground. A folk dance, loud, energetic, something you would expect to see at a festival, a wedding, or a national celebration. To a modern audience, it signals culture, tradition, identity, not danger. But the longer you watch, the harder it becomes to ignore the tension beneath the surface. The movements are too sharp for entertainment, too compressed, too aggressive. The dancer constantly drops his center of gravity, collapsing downward and then exploding upward again, as if reacting to pressure that no one else can see. His legs snap out with sudden violence. His torso coils and releases. His balance never switches off. There is no decorative stillness, no relaxed posture, no moment held for applause. This is not how people move to be admired. This is how people move, when hesitation is punished immediately and mistakes are paid for with blood. The dance is called Hopak. Today, it is framed as folklore, a symbol of national pride and cultural memory. Historically, it emerged in a world where survival was never abstract, and violence was not an exception, but a permanent condition of life. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, Eastern Europe was not a stable map of nations, but a living frontier. Borders shifted constantly. Empires collided, withdrew, and returned. Ottoman forces pushed north, Polish armies pressed east, and local powers fought over territory that rarely stayed quiet for long. Villages were burned, trade routes were raided, and armed groups moved through the landscape with little warning. In this unstable space lived the Cossacks, not a nation in the modern sense, but a warrior society. Semi-independent, highly mobile, and permanently exposed to conflict, they existed between states rather than inside them. They were hired as mercenaries, feared as raiders, and relied on speed, aggression, and unpredictability rather than numbers or heavy protection. Their lives revolved around ambushes, river raids, cavalry clashes, and sudden close-quarters fights where hesitation meant death. This reality shaped how the body itself was treated. There were no permanent academies, no standardized drills, no safe environments for open military preparation. In many regions, carrying weapons was restricted, and gatherings of armed men were closely watched or actively suppressed. Visibility was dangerous. Attention meant control. Yet the body still had to be ready at any moment. Legs needed explosive power to close distance or break away instantly. Balance had to survive chaos, uneven ground, and sudden impacts. Endurance had to hold under prolonged stress, pain, and fear. Reaction had to become instinct rather than conscious thought. So training adapted by hiding in plain sight. Music provided rhythm, celebration provided camouflage. What looked like a dance allowed the body to rehearse violence without naming it. Deep squats trained sudden drops below an incoming strike. Violent jumps conditioned the legs for rapid engagement or escape. Spins drilled control of momentum and orientation while moving at speed. Falls taught how to hit the ground, absorb impact, and rise already prepared to continue the fight. Repetition burned these patterns into muscle memory, bypassing analysis entirely. Hopak was not created to be elegant. It was created to be useful. It compressed experience into movement, turning survival into repetition. There were no manuals, no diagrams, no written doctrine. The knowledge lived in flesh, breath, and rhythm, passed from one body to another through imitation, fatigue, and shared danger. That is the real dissonance. What we now label as folk culture may once have functioned as a silent training language, refined by men who expected violence as a constant condition of life. Seen from that angle, Hopak stops being a celebration. It becomes preparation. And once that shift happens, the dance never looks innocent again. If Hopak looks like celebration, that illusion exists for a reason. In the world the Cossacks inhabited, visibility was a liability. Power did not tolerate autonomous fighters, and states did not trust men who knew how to move, strike, and disappear without orders. Across Eastern Europe, authorities tried to control violence by regulating bodies. Weapons were banned or limited. Armed assemblies were monitored. Any sign of organized military training outside official structures attracted attention, and attention led to suppression. For a warrior society living on the margins of empires, this created a paradox: the need to stay permanently combat ready while appearing harmless enough to be ignored. This pressure shaped behavior long before it shaped culture. Open drills were dangerous. Rehearsing formations or practicing weapons invited scrutiny. Even standing too confidently, too balanced, too coordinated could mark a man as a threat. The safest training was the kind that did not look like training at all, and that is where dance stopped being entertainment and became a solution. Music solved a practical problem. Rhythm allowed timing to be drilled without commands. Repetition could happen without explanation. A crowd provided cover. Celebration justified exhaustion. Under the noise of instruments and the chaos of movement, bodies were being refined, coordination was sharpened, legs were conditioned for explosive effort, breathing adapted to sustained exertion. None of it required spoken instruction. The structure lived in the rhythm itself. Hopak worked because it was public. It happened in daylight, in front of witnesses. What could look less threatening than men dancing? The same movements that trained rapid drops and violent direction changes were framed as tradition. The same jumps that built combat-ready legs were applauded as athletic flair. Even aggression could be masked as passion, energy, spirit. Outsiders saw spectacle. Insiders felt preparation. This was not unique to one village or one generation. The logic repeated wherever pressure existed. When a society cannot train openly, training mutates. It compresses. It hides inside acceptable forms. What mattered was not the story told to observers, but the effect on the body. Over time, the dance became a filter. Those who could not endure the strain fell away. Those who stayed developed balance, resilience, and control without ever naming what they were becoming. Importantly, this was not about memorizing techniques. There were no fixed sequences meant to be reproduced exactly. The goal was adaptability. Bodies trained this way learned to react instead of calculate. The constant changes in level, direction, and tempo forced the nervous system to stay alert. Fatigue was not a side effect. It was part of the process. Fighting rarely happens when you are fresh. Hopak conditioned men to function while exhausted, disoriented, and under pressure, long before they ever stepped into real violence. To an outside authority, Hopak was noise, color, movement. To those inside the system, it was maintenance, a way to keep the body sharp without leaving fingerprints, a method of passing knowledge without writing it down, nothing that could be confiscated, nothing that could be banned without banning celebration itself. That is why the disguise mattered, not as deception for its own sake, but as survival strategy. In a world where power watched constantly, the safest weapon was the one no one recognized. And long before anyone called it culture, Hopak functioned as exactly that. Invisible preparation, practiced in plain sight, hiding danger behind rhythm and motion. Once the disguise is understood, the movements themselves stop looking chaotic. What appears spontaneous begins to reveal a brutal internal logic. Hopak is not a collection of random jumps and spins. It is a system that overloads the body in very specific ways. Long before modern sports science gave names to these principles, the Cossacks were training explosive power, joint resilience, balance recovery, and spatial awareness through motion that never allowed comfort or symmetry. The dance forces the body into constant problem-solving under fatigue, exactly the condition real violence creates. Take the low squats, often dismissed as theatrical bravado. Dropping deep while staying mobile is not decorative. It trains rapid changes in elevation, allowing the body to disappear below the line of attack and re-emerge instantly. In a saber fight or a sudden clash at close range, height is exposure. The ability to collapse downward without losing balance turns the legs into shock absorbers and springs at the same time. This is not flexibility for its own sake. It is survival geometry. Then there are the jumps. Hopak is filled with violent vertical and horizontal explosions that leave no time to reset. These movements build what modern training would call plyometric power, but without isolation. The hips, knees, and ankles are loaded together repeatedly under exhaustion. The result is a lower body capable of sudden acceleration, rapid disengagement, and brutal impact. In a battlefield context, this translates directly to closing distance, breaking contact, or staying upright after collision. Weak legs do not survive chaos. The wide leg extensions and split-like motions are often misunderstood as acrobatics. In reality, they force extreme control at the edges of stability. Extending the legs outward while airborne trains coordination under loss of ground contact, something that happens constantly in real combat, on uneven terrain, during grappling, or after being struck. The body learns not to panic when balance disappears. It learns how to recover mid-motion, not after landing safely. Equally important is how Hopak teaches falling. Real fights end on the ground more often than people admit. Hard surfaces, obstacles, bodies colliding. Falling is inevitable. Hopak incorporates drops, rolls, and low transitions that condition the body to absorb impact without freezing. The goal is not elegance, but continuity. Hit the ground, redirect force, keep moving. The nervous system is trained to treat falling as a phase, not a failure. The rotations matter just as much. Spins are not there to impress. They drill control over momentum, orientation, and peripheral awareness. Turning while staying balanced trains the inner ear and stabilizing muscles to function under disorientation. In a multi-opponent environment, losing spatial awareness is fatal. These rotations teach the body to move fast without losing its sense of direction, even when vision blurs and footing is unstable. What ties all of this together is fatigue. Hopak does not allow full recovery between movements. The legs burn, breathing accelerates, coordination degrades, and the dance continues. This is deliberate. Technique that only works when fresh is decoration. By forcing the body to perform complex actions while exhausted, Hopak builds reliability under stress. Decisions shrink. Reaction replaces calculation. There is no single technique hidden inside the dance. There is something more valuable, a body shaped to tolerate chaos, strength without stiffness, speed without loss of control, balance that survives disruption. This is not training for sport, where conditions are controlled. It is training for environments where nothing is fair, predictable, or clean. Seen through this lens, Hopak becomes legible. Every motion loads the joints, taxes coordination, and sharpens reaction. It is not choreography pretending to be combat. It is combat logic pretending to be choreography. And by the time the music stops, the body has already learned what the mind was never formally taught. Once the body is understood as the primary system, the presence of weapons stops feeling like a separate layer. In the Cossack world, there was no hard boundary between unarmed movement and armed combat. The same mechanics that governed the dance governed the use of steel. Hopak did not teach weapons directly, but it prepared the body to use them naturally, without needing a new language. When a saber entered the hand, the movement did not change. It simply became sharper. The most obvious connection lies in the shoulders and hips. Hopak constantly trains rotational power through the torso, forcing the upper and lower body to work as a single unit. This is the engine of cutting weapons. A saber does not strike effectively through arm strength alone. Power comes from the ground, travels through the legs, rotates through the hips, and releases through the shoulders and wrists. The wide, sweeping arm, motion seen in the dance mirror, this exact kinetic chain. What looks exaggerated without context becomes efficient when steel is added. Cossack sabers favored speed and flow over brute force. They were meant for continuous motion, not static blocks. Hopak conditions the body to keep moving even while striking. Weight shifts never stop. The feet are always repositioning, the torso always adjusting. This makes the fighter difficult to read and harder to trap. Against rigid European fencing styles, built around linear exchanges and formal guards, this unpredictability was a problem. The Cossack fighter did not reset after each action. One motion bled into the next. The same logic applies to impact weapons like the Chekins, short war hammers designed for close-range brutality. Using them effectively requires precise timing and body alignment rather than raw strength. Hopak's compact rotations and sudden level changes train exactly that. Dropping low while rotating allows strikes to come from unexpected angles. Rising out of a squat converts leg drive directly into impact. The dance teaches how to deliver force while remaining mobile rather than planting the feet and committing fully. Pole weapons, too, fit naturally into this system. Spears and pikes demand spatial awareness, balance, and constant adjustment of distance. Hopak trains the body to read space instinctively. Long strides, sudden retreats, and lateral movement are baked into the dance. The body becomes comfortable managing range without conscious calculation. When a long weapon is added, the principles remain the same. Control distance, change levels, never become static. Defensive movements are equally embedded. Many of the sweeping arm gestures in Hopak resemble expressive flourishes when empty-handed. With a weapon, they become deflections, redirections, and covers. Rather than meeting force head-on, the motion guides it away while the body shifts position. This is not a system built on stopping attacks, but on surviving them long enough to counter. Crucially, Hopak does not train fixed sequences with weapons. There are no choreographed combinations meant to be repeated exactly. Instead, it builds a body capable of improvisation. The fighter is not memorizing techniques. He is learning how to move under pressure while holding an object that amplifies every mistake. This makes the transition between armed and unarmed combat seamless. Drop the weapon, and the body keeps fighting. Pick one up, and nothing feels foreign. This integration explains why Hopak could survive even when weapons were restricted. The knowledge did not live in drills that could be banned or confiscated. It lived in motion. A man who danced this way already knew how to cut, strike, and defend, even if he never practiced openly with steel. The weapon was never the core. It was an extension. By the time blades were drawn for real, there was no need to think. The body already understood rotation, distance, timing, and recovery. The dance had done its work long before the fight began. All of this movement, strength, and coordination would be useless without the correct internal state. Violence is not solved by mechanics alone. Fear disrupts timing. Fatigue breaks posture. Pain collapses focus. The Cossacks understood this long before psychology had a name for it, and Hopak addressed the problem directly. Not through theory, but through rhythm. Music was not decoration. It was a tool. Drums, clapping, and stringed instruments imposed an external tempo that the body had to obey. Once movement locks into rhythm, hesitation decreases. Actions begin to flow without conscious decision-making. Breathing synchronizes. Heart rate stabilizes under exertion. The mind narrows. This is not calm, and it is not chaos. It is a functional middle state where awareness sharpens and unnecessary thought drops away. Hopak pushes the dancer toward this state deliberately. The pace escalates. Movements repeat under exhaustion. The legs burn, lungs strain, coordination frays, and the rhythm continues regardless. The body learns to function while uncomfortable, to keep moving even as signals of fatigue grow louder. This mirrors real combat more closely than controlled training ever could. Fights do not wait for recovery. Stress compounds. Hopak conditions the nervous system to accept that pressure as normal. This is where the concept often described as Cossack spas begins to make sense. Stripped of mythology, it refers to a practical phenomenon, heightened responsiveness under threat. Faster reactions. Reduced perception of pain, increased tolerance for impact. Modern science would describe this as an adrenaline-driven state combined with learned control. Hopak did not create this response, but it trained the body to enter it reliably. Breathing played a critical role. Under intense movement, untrained bodies panic and lose rhythm. Hopak forces continuous breathing under strain, preventing shallow gasping. Oxygen intake stabilizes, delaying exhaustion and preserving coordination. This allowed Cossack fighters to maintain aggression and mobility longer than opponents who burned out quickly. Endurance here was not about long-distance stamina, but about surviving sustained bursts of chaos. Equally important was emotional regulation. Hopak expresses aggression openly. Movements are sharp, forceful, unapologetic. This provides an outlet for tension rather than suppressing it. Anger, excitement, and fear are channeled into motion instead of turning inward. The result is not blind rage, but controlled intensity. A fighter who can express aggression without losing structure is far more dangerous than one who tries to remain calm and fails. Group performance amplified this effect. Dancing together synchronized bodies and nervous systems. Rhythm aligned reactions. Energy fed energy. This created cohesion without commands, allowing individuals to act independently while still moving as part of a whole. In chaotic engagements, this kind of implicit coordination mattered more than rigid formations. The key point is this: Hopak trained fighters to operate inside stress, not to avoid it. The dance did not teach how to stay relaxed. It taught how to function while activated. Once this state became familiar, entering it in real violence required less effort. The body recognized the sensation and did not freeze. Without this psychophysical layer, the strength, balance, and weapon integration of the previous blocks would collapse under pressure. Technique alone does not survive fear, but rhythm, repetition, and controlled exhaustion build something deeper than technique. They build reliability. This is why Hopak cannot be understood as choreography alone. It is not just movement, and it is not just training. It is a method for preparing the body and mind to accept violence as a working environment. When the music stopped and the rhythm faded, that state did not vanish. It stayed, waiting to be used. To understand why Hopak unsettled professional soldiers, it helps to see what European warfare expected from a trained fighter. Western combat systems of the early modern period valued predictability. Formations, drills, repeatable techniques, clear hierarchies of movement. Even individual fencing systems were built around recognizable guards, lines, and responses. A trained opponent was dangerous, but also readable. Cossack fighters broke that logic. Hopak did not produce standardized silhouettes. It did not lock the body into upright posture or linear footwork. Levels constantly changed. Rhythm fluctuated. Attacks emerged from angles that traditional guards were not designed to cover. A fighter could be upright one moment, under the opponent's line the next, then airborne, then circling. This forced constant recalculation, and recalculation costs time. Against rigid systems, unpredictability becomes a weapon by itself. European fencers trained to control distance and tempo. Hopak deliberately disrupted both. Sudden drops to the ground collapsed expected attack ranges. Explosive jumps bypassed normal footwork exchanges. Rotational attacks ignored the idea of facing an opponent head-on. Even when techniques overlapped superficially, the context was different. A slash delivered from a dance rotation carried momentum that standard parries were not calibrated for. This is why Cossacks were described as chaotic, even undisciplined by their enemies. That judgment missed the point. The chaos was structured internally, but invisible externally. There were no obvious patterns to memorize, no forms to recognize, no rhythm the enemy could synchronize with. Comparisons to modern combat sports reveal the same tension. In controlled environments like MMA, effectiveness is measured under rules, weight classes, time limits, and referees. Hopak was shaped in an environment without any of that. No rounds, no resets, no prohibition against multiple attackers, uneven terrain, or weapons entering the fight mid-exchange. Techniques were selected not for fairness, but for survival. This does not mean Hopak was better in an abstract sense. It means it was optimized for a different problem. Modern fighters trained to win matches. Cossacks trained to stay alive in ambushes, raids, and skirmishes where clarity vanished instantly. Under those conditions, flexibility beats perfection. Eastern martial arts present another contrast. Many Asian systems emphasize internal control, rooted stances, and refined transmission through lineages. Hopak shared the idea of internal state, but not the preservation of form. There was no sacred posture to maintain. Movements mutated freely based on terrain, fatigue, and opportunity. What mattered was function, not aesthetics. This fluidity is also why Hopak struggled to survive as a formalized system. Once warfare professionalized and centralized, its advantages became less visible. Armies preferred drills that could be replicated quickly across thousands of bodies. Hopak resisted mass standardization. It lived best in small groups and individual fighters. Its modern revival reflects that tension. Contemporary combat Hopak often freezes movements into teachable sequences. This preserves heritage, but risks losing the original logic. The historical power of the system was not in exact steps, but in principles, adaptability, rhythm under stress, and constant transition. When viewed this way, Hopak sits outside the usual hierarchy of martial arts. It is neither sport nor battlefield manual. It is a cultural combat language shaped by necessity and eroded by peace. Its effectiveness was never about dominating every opponent, but about refusing to be predictable. And unpredictability, when paired with conditioning and intent, remains one of the most difficult things to fight against, regardless of era. By the time firearms reshaped warfare and standing armies replaced raiding cultures, Hopak lost its original function. It no longer decided who lived through a night ambush or who returned from a raid. What remained was the shell: music, movement, celebration. To an outside observer, it became folklore, something loud, athletic, colorful, and safely detached from violence. But systems like this do not disappear completely. They compress. Hopak survived because it was never just a combat manual. It was a way of encoding behavior into the body: strength without rigidity, aggression without loss of control, chaos without panic. These qualities do not require battlefields to remain useful. They migrate into culture, posture, and identity. What looks like performance is often storage. For Western audiences, this is the hardest part to grasp. Modern societies separate art and violence cleanly. Dance is expression. Combat is utility. For the Cossacks, that line barely existed. Life on the frontier erased it. Training, celebration, intimidation, and psychological conditioning overlapped constantly. Hopak was not performed to look impressive. It looked impressive because it was built to work. This is why attempts to reduce it to a single explanation always fail. It is not secret kung fu, and it is not a lost superweapon. It is a reflection of a world where every able body was a potential fighter, and every social activity carried survival value. When danger is permanent, efficiency leaks into everything. Seen this way, Hopak becomes a cultural fossil, not of movements, but of mindset. A reminder of how humans adapt when formal institutions cannot protect them. When there are no uniforms, no clear borders, no guarantees. In that environment, the body itself becomes the last reliable tool, and it must be trained everywhere, all the time, without drawing attention. That is why the dance mattered, not because it hid techniques, but because it normalized readiness. It made extreme physicality acceptable. It embedded violence-adjacent movement into joy, music, and identity. A community that dances like this is never truly unarmed, even when weapons are gone. Modern revivals often miss this point. They search for authenticity in steps, costumes, and rankings. But authenticity was never about preservation. It was about function under pressure. The original Hopak was successful not because it was preserved, but because it evolved constantly, absorbing whatever worked and discarding whatever didn't. What remains today is a choice. Hopak can be treated as heritage, something to be remembered and admired, or it can be understood as a lesson that the most resilient systems rarely announce themselves as systems at all. They hide in plain sight, disguised as culture. So when you see Hopak as a dance, you are not wrong, but you are not seeing the whole picture. You are watching the surface of something that once prepared people to move, breathe, and think inside violence, and to do so without ever calling it training. That is not nostalgia. That is a warning from history. True mastery rarely looks like a weapon. It looks ordinary until it's needed.